Good evening, everyone, and welcome to NBCUniversal. Just a few housekeeping points. We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening, so if it does ring, it is a problem. So you either out this door here or go out the way you came. It will become obvious where you come out. You're coming straight out into the street there, so hopefully that doesn't happen.
Can we collect wine as we go out?
Yes, if they haven't taken it away already.
Okay.
If it's mould,
they're very quick on that. Also, you're probably all aware already, but if you do need to go to the loo, go back down through the stairs, and just as you come to the lifts, do a left and straight through the door, and the toilets are down there. So, without further ado, have a great evening. I'll pass over to Andy Question.
Thank you. I'm going to stand next to Bruce because he's got a microphone. Not because I like it. So, welcome. Many of you have been before to Bill Lovell Lectures. You know why they're here, but just for those who haven't, hands up anybody who hasn't been to one of these before. Hey, that's really. Oh, right, right. So, for those who didn't know Bill Lovell, we have this amazing template for the presentation, which I send to the presenter, who then completely ignores my email. So you would have to listen to me talking about. So Bill used to work for the BBC, Ealing Film Studios, which is where I met him as a technical assistant 40 years ago, when I was trying to solder Nagra plugs to Nagra cables. And anybody knows anything about the Nagra, you've got this tiny little plug,
not designed for humans,
cable, and you have to try and get that soldered together. And that's where I learned that sound. Boom swingers and sound guys hated each other because otherwise why would they walk in opposite directions so much? So I met him there. He was made redundant and then went to ARRI, where he worked on film, but he also kept talking and was very interested in this strange electronic stuff, originally ENG, and how the BBC was trying to bend ENG cameras to make them usable. He built the first ARRI prototype electronic camera, and obviously the rest is really history. So unfortunately Bill, very active SMPTE member, suddenly passed away, which is quite a shock to most of us, but this is his legacy. It's unique to the UK SMPTE branch. Encourage those who aren't members. Anybody not a member? Andrew?
You'll be taken out later for the appropriate ceremony.
I encourage you to join. We are now are we the third or fourth biggest? Third biggest. Yeah, third biggest. So that means only New York and Hollywood are bigger. So we're looking for world domination. So more members, please.
Yes.
We'll take New York out first, and then we'll go straight for Hollywood, and then we can get rid of 24 frame.
Can we do fractional frame rates first, please? No, please, no.
We don't do fractional frame rates. We just ignore them. Bill Lovell's boss is the only non-UK-based person to give this lecture, and I thought that was the first one. He introduced the idea. It's a retrospective. In other words, I prowl around the various conferences looking for victims. Hands up, those please, so we can see who have already given a lecture. Good, there's 3 of you in here already. I'm going to build an alumni set soon. I'm going to make a change next year. I've asked someone that's quite young to do it. I'm not going to give names away now, but I will pressure her to give this lecture because I'm a bit concerned about the gender balance. So I'm still looking at other people in this room who are SMPTE members, unfortunately. So I'm encouraging you to be a SMPTE member, and I know you're a SMPTE member. So just watch.
Be afraid.
Yeah. But it's a celebration of the UK SMPTE branch, which restarted 4 or 5 years ago? 7 years ago. 7 years ago. Oh, God, I think that's it. I actually remember it was in that strange wine bar in the Media Village. Davies, that's it. That's gone. I'm not sure about Herman the German. I don't understand that one of that brand at all, but I know West 12 Studios are a great new office for me. And they do a £1 off everything if you have a BBC Club card. So Bruce kindly offered when I kicked him, beat him up, and
I still have all my fingers, and most of them are real.
Yeah. To give this year's lecture. So I'm going to hand over to Bruce. Simon will do a bit of housekeeping at the end of what's coming, what's going on, and why. And of course, we're just going to thank NBCUniversal. I will make no jokes about Comcast companies. I can't help it. A Comcast company. It's actually like the what's it, Grass Valley or Belden.
Belden brand.
Yeah, Belden brand. It's going to be like that soon, isn't it? The BBC a Belden brand, or is it Comcast brand, or yeah, thank you. But anyway, Bruce, it's all yours for the
Thank you,
next 3 seconds.
3 seconds. Oh, there we go. Right, I should put a timer on. So thank you, everyone. I should point out that Mr MXF is a Jane Devlin permissive existence. While we're on the sort of tagline thing, who can't be here this evening because she's, I don't know, busy.
Picking up your mess.
Yeah, undoing all the damage that I've put into the world. When Andy asked me to do this, I thought, what shall I do? Shall I give you some deep tech introduction to the delights and fallacies of what people think file transfer is? Or shall I give you an interesting slideshow of people you know looking old, looking really young and embarrassing? And I thought Plan B sounded like a much better evening of entertainment. So for those of you who are in some of these slides, I am literally not sorry at all. So let's start off with perhaps the most embarrassing. So in the beginning, so this is Melbourne in 1973, I think, as far as we can place it. As you can tell, that this is the beginning of an elite athlete. You can tell that basically there's a Tour de France athlete trying to get out of those legs. You can also tell that I need all the help I can get in basically just dressing myself, and unfortunately my daughter is in Exeter, so this was the best I could do without any assistance. And actually that is a normal sized briefcase, and actually I'm going to sort of start off with talking a little bit about my childhood, because it kind of affects who I am and some of the weirdnesses that I portray, because that is a normal sized briefcase, and that was a normal sized Bruce aged about 8. And this was in Melbourne, in Australia. We were brought up in an environment that was slightly more Catholic than the Pope, and bear in mind, in that era the Pope owned a condom factory in Italy, so the Pope was not as Catholic as maybe some of the other Catholics are. So to give you an idea of scale, these are the other children in my class, and they were pretty much all sort of built like that, or at least that's what they looked like from where I was sitting. And they were made up like this. There was about 50% toxic masculinity. There was probably about 25% sporadic violence, and topped off with about 25% Catholic indoctrination. Which, if you were for pretty much the first 14 years of your existence the smallest child in the school, not just your class, you know, when you were year 10 equivalent, I used to look up at the year 7s. It was just ridiculous. I don't know why I didn't grow. Maybe it was the shorts, but this kind of affected a lot of my attitudes to life. So my schooling had a bit of a roundabout sporadic existence and covered a couple of countries. For scale, by the way, that's how big the UK is relative to Australia. It's also, for scale, how interesting each country is in the tourist demographic, but that's really based on tourism. So when I was this little kid, and we changed schools every year, sometimes twice a year. By the time I was 30, I'd lived in 33 permanent addresses, I'd been to 10 schools and colleges, and only been hospitalised twice by school bullies, which I thought, given I was a tiny kid, was actually a bloody good record compared to some of the others. But I was smart and quiet. And by smart, I mean I knew how to stay quiet when people asked me questions that you really shouldn't answer. And I kind of figured out early on that survival was based on sort of knowing the politics of the environment in which you live. And for a lot of the schools, particularly in Australia, it was basically you had the playground bullies. They were sort of the ones that dragged their knuckles on the ground and didn't bother to write anything. Then you had the homework bullies who had lifted their knuckles up and had you know good pedicures and probably pedicures because it's mostly feet. And they were the ones who wanted you to do your homework for them, because you know, if you got the top marks in homework, why would they be asked to go and do their homework if they could just beat on the small kid to do it for them? And then there were the teachers, priests and parents, and they actually were the ones to really be afraid of, because they had weapons. They would come at you with belts and buckles and bats and anything just to make you toe the line so that they would have an easy life. This is not an exaggeration, by the way. It really was a horribly violent existence. You just have to read some of the histories about what 1970s Australia was like. It's not the lovely demographic egalitarian place it is of lovely cuddliness today. Moving on. One of the things I figured out really early on was that these guys, it was quite interesting that they really only cared about peer pressure. And that if you found the biggest, hairiest, ugliest, beaty-uppiest person and somehow made them feel better about themselves, that was an excuse for someone else to get pasted rather than you. That was a win. These people over here really only cared about attention from those people up there, although why on earth you'd want attention from those people up there, I never figured that out. But if you did their homework and occasionally just lobbed in something interesting that, you know, made all the attention go that way, that was a double header, because not only would the homework bullies not bother you, but neither would the teachers, priests or parents bother you, because they were too busy looking at the homework bullies. So very early on, according to my school reports, I had this kind of horrible, sly, political nous about me. Don't quite know where it came from. I think it was survival. Anyway, after a long time of travelling around the world, I ended up at this wonderful establishment in Stafford. Anyone been to Stafford? One person's been to Stafford. 2 people. Excellent. So I just want you to, use your imagination here. Just imagine that the British Isles is like a human body, and we've got sort of one leg coming down here, and we've got one leg coming down there, and we've got a body and we've got a head. Stafford, if the body's facing away from you, is pretty much somewhere to leave as quickly as you possibly can. And the Blessed William Howard was literally the cherry in the middle of that place. It was horrible. 2 children died while I was there. One of them blew themselves up trying to build a shotgun. Idiot. And we're not even going to go into what the teenage pregnancies rates were, but it was not a great place for learning, except there was this one physics guy who was a bit nuts, and he'd heard about this thing called computing. And so he got the maths class to write some software. Now, because we had no money, either as a family or as a school, writing software basically involved him, as far as I can figure out, going and getting all the unused cards from the North Staffordshire Polytechnic, sorry, it's a university now, getting all the unused cards, driving them himself to the maths class, where we filled these things in, looking up, I should ask, anybody know what the coding is on these cards? Anybody know the name of it? Hollerith, Hermann Hollerith, the great textile manufacturer from Germany. Hollerith coding. So these things are coded with Hollerith code. So what we'd have to do as a maths class, using our massive intellects, which was sort of putting the Midlands back on the computing map, we'd look up the table over here and we get a number, then we'd flick over to the table over there and figure out what the code was, and we'd rub them in with graphite pencils in each column. So 1, 0, because it was BASIC that we're programming in, and we'd fill out our each line of code like that, and then there'd be a machine a little bit like this one. I couldn't find the actual machine, but this one's close enough that you put the cards in the card hopper here, and it would go across a scanner. The scanner would then read the graphite, and there's some punches inside there which would then stamp the graphite, and that would be your code. And then some human being, robot, some automation device would then take the cards out the hopper there, put them into the in-hopper in some other machine, and then I think it was a VAX PDP-8 was the actual machine we were using, would then run your code, and the output would be in-punch cards, which you would then get, and then you'd have to reverse the process of decoding what the Hollerith code was and do it by hand, because that's all the budget we had. Does anyone know by any stretch of the imagination what corporation was the last company in the UK to have a service contract on a card reader? It was BBC Research and Development Department. kept all of its field strength data for its transmitters on cards, to the extent where a friend of mine, David Morton, who was the editor of PC World back in the late 80s, he invited some of his buddies over to the BBC Open Day. I say he invited, I snuck them in. And I've got a photo somewhere, again I couldn't find it in time for this, of them sneaking like sort of, little sneaky people through the corridors to actually look at and touch this card reader, which still had a service contract on it. It was about 1988, it was absolutely hilarious. That year also my dad died. which was really sudden. He kissed me on the head on Saturday morning, went out to play golf, dropped dead. Which is a bit sad, really. And it wasn't until I did a little bit of research in the family history that I realised that my dad died at 52. Oh, his dad died at 50, my uncle died at 53, his brother died at 54. Go one generation out there, they died in their 40s or their 50s, and pretty much 0 members of my family ever lived past 55, which is the age I am today. So if you're not nice to me, I will, just to spite you, I will drop dead on the floor here. But it did say one thing to me, which was that my dad was a heavy smoker and drinker. Well, I don't smoke. But I kind of figured out that if all of them died of disease, there was one thing I was not going to die of, and that was a heart problem. Which is why, if anybody wants to come for a bike ride with me, I will happily take you. And Paul Gardner, outstanding 4K the other Wednesday, by the way. Anyone who gets on the bus with their own without any assistance really did very well. And you, Rowan, as well, excellent. Anybody else do the 4K? We'll do that. Yeah, and Simon, there we go. That's outstanding. We represent about 10% of that race. That is pretty excellent. So that's one of the reasons why I am the ridiculously sporty person I am, and I've grown to like it, although back in the early days I really didn't. Anyway, moving on. So once my dad had died, we suddenly realised that because we'd moved around so much, and Dad pretty much changed jobs every 2 years, and we changed sometimes country every year or changed city every year, we changed schools every year, that my mother had no pension. That was fun. And so we had almost no money at all. So Mum decided that the best thing to do was to move to Cambridge, because they have good education in Cambridge, unless you're a Catholic, which is a shame. We went to a school called, this is going to be on the internet, so I should be slightly careful about what I say. So we went to a school called St Bede's. I won't give you the details unless we go to the pub afterwards, but suffice it to say that they closed the school down shortly after I was there and brought the nuns in to try and sort it out again. It was not a good school. I got 10 O-levels. The next best person got 7. I think the next one was 3, and then the average was 1 CSE, I think. It was really not a high-quality school. But we lived 1 hour and 30 minutes away by bus, because we got free bus, and that was the only place we could afford at the time. And because the bus only left once an hour, that gave me about 55 minutes to take the things that I'd learned programming that PDP-8 with the punched cards, and to go into Tandy's, and each evening I could type slightly faster than the previous evening, and I could type slightly more of my code in, and get slightly more of my program to run to see the thing work, until they turned the power off at the end of the day, and I'd have to start again from scratch the following day. So I pretty much taught myself to program because we lived a long way away by bus, and every now and again I'd be a right rebel. I'd miss the bus, so I'd get 1 hour and 55 minutes instead of 50 minutes. Anyone here actually used the ZX80? Excellent. Did you actually get the burns on your fingers where if you actually keep it on long enough and run it long enough that it gets to a temperature where you can actually burn a 14-year-old's fingers? They are just evil, horrible machines. Thank you, Clive Sinclair. Yeah. But wherever there was a computer, I was the silent, geeky nerd that was on it trying to do interesting stuff with it. Can anyone name all of them? I mean, the names are on. No? Anyone know whether one on the top left was a marketing failure in France?
Commodore?
It is a Commodore.
20?
Nope.
C64?
Nope. No, it's the C64. That one's the Commodore PET. Anyone know what the word for fart is in French? Yeah, it was not a great success in that country. So pretty much every sort of school open day or any friend's house that I was at, I was just the computery nerd that was in there trying to figure out what these new personal computer things are. Then I got to sixth form college, and basically this was our computing resources. Anyone know what it says on the thing. Anyone know what was powering that thing on the left?
Z80, CPM.
It was exactly the same thing that was powering the Sinclair machine. So basically it's a Sinclair Z80 with 2 8-inch floppy disks and little else other than the power supply that didn't mean that you burnt your fingers while you were typing on the thing. And computer games were starting to become a thing, but we had no money and we weren't allowed to run games in the school, so you had to write your own. So pretty much you're hamstrung by what you can comfortably do in a break time and the data rate that you could get off 2 8 1/4 inch floppy disks, one for code, one for data. So I ended up writing a game that was quite popular. It was like asteroids but horizontally, because the screen refresh was faster if you moved your objects from left to right and you moved the spaceship up and down. That was a much better user experience than moving the objects up and down and moving the spaceship left and right. So we had a thing called boulderoids, which was like a cross between galaxians and asteroids, but that worked quite well. And actually we made a small amount of money charging kids to play this thing at lunchtimes and break times, as long as the teachers weren't there. But this thing was really this was the main machine, because we were now connected to a PDP-11, not yet PDP-8. PDP-11, for those that I was going to say young, but actually you can still be quite old and not know what a PDP-11 is nowadays. This was the thing about the size of a wardrobe and had about the compute performance of a low-end Ericsson phone with no user interface. And we were on a 110 board teletype, so actually to try get any gaming performance out of a 110 board teletype was quite interesting. But we did manage to do a version of Pac-Man which was quite good on a kind of wide but not very tall matrix, that the thing would print out where you were and where the things were coming at you, and it had some concept of time, so you had to move and guess where the Pac-Man munchy things would come at you. So we managed to get quite an interesting teletype Pac-Man, until the guy that was running the computing department figured out who wrote the code and charged me personally, using the money I'd got for writing boulderoids, to pay for the paper that went into the teletype, so I actually ended up broke again. But this was the early days of Bruce the entrepreneur, trying to figure out how on earth I can get myself out of not having any money to do anything ever. So after sixth form college, I went to GEC Large Machines, General Electric Company. This was a company that was probably out of date in the early 80s. So it was probably living somewhere between 1955 and 1958 in terms of its technology and what it did. But the good thing it did do is you went on a 12-week machine shop before you actually did anything. So I learned how to use lathes, I learned how to use milling machines, I learned how not to lose any limbs in the automated saw, despite the fact at this stage I was almost normal size. I was still a bit short, but I was almost become normal size by this stage. So the bullies had realized that there was more to gain by financially getting me into trouble rather than physically beating me, because I couldn't type as fast as I was physically broken. And I learnt to weld. And I also learnt the way that everybody does, that if you don't cover every bit of your body, the suntan doesn't last and you end up turning into a snake and all your skin falls off. But most of the time, because the guys that were running the machine shop were about 180 years old, as far as I could figure out, they liked to torture the people that were learning their skills. So they'd give you these wonderful exercises like, here's a piece of steel. It's 6 1/4 inches long, it's 4 1/4 inches wide, and it's 1 1/4 inches deep. Make it 6 by 4 by 1 using only a hacksaw, and it's got to be accurate to 4 thou. And so you're sitting there with this file going, and you put the little micrometer on, it's like, no! So that was a week that I will never get back. And unfortunately, I did find out where those guys lived, but I never followed through with what I thought I'd do to them if I ever found that out. But the only thing that I really remember, the thing that I absolutely loved, was the 2 days we had with the CNC machine. That's the closest picture I could find to the one that we actually used. And we were given this exercise to program the CNC machine, where you had to take this bit of foam, because they wouldn't let you do anything stupid like use a real bit of metal, because think of the cost of destroying the CNC machine. We had to make a square on the outside, a circle on the inside, leaving a little triangle inside the circle, and in the middle you had to have an even smaller triangle with a flat bottom. And the fact that they'd written flat bottom made me do all the sums to realise, if you don't take the cutter across the middle, there'll be a little dink that everybody else will fail on. And so because I'd learnt sneakiness as a small child, I recognised sneakiness in others by this stage, which was a good life lesson. But that was the most interesting thing, probably to this day, that I've ever programmed, because you could actually kill yourself if you got the programming wrong, and that's a real incentive to get it right. So this was great fun. I really enjoyed that. But what I did in the evenings, because there was no internet, so you couldn't do that, what I did in the evenings was thank the Welsh. Anyone here Welsh? Woo! Go Welsh. The Dragon 64, made in Wales. It was going to be the personal computer to revolutionise the world, and they went bust 2 years after they started. But it was actually an outstanding computer. It was more powerful than the BBC Micro. It was significantly more powerful than that ridiculous Z80 machine. So I saved up all of my pennies from my various schemes that I'd had, and I bought myself one of these thinking, I know, I'm going to take Chucky Egg, which was just a thing that was starting to be really important on the BBC Micro platform, and I'm going to port that by actually just looking at how the game works and rewriting it from scratch, because I had no facilities to do anything else, on the Dragon 64. And I just about got to the stage where my version of Chucky Egg on the Dragon 64 was as good as the version of Chucky Egg on the BBC when the Dragon 64 went bust. And my dependency on the Welsh disappeared. Still like the Welsh. So, this stage, I went to university. Don't remember very much about university, if I'm honest. Can't think why I didn't remember very much about university. You might have noticed that there was a video playing. So if you want to see what I did in university, and one of my main ways that I remember what I did, is I watched that series. Queen's a Cambridge College, particularly episode 5, with Mark Doherty on the left and Bruce Devlin on the right. Mark was my lab partner. Mark and I were best buddies. We did absolutely everything together, apart from homework, of which I did an awful lot, because back in the early days I'd figured out that hiding from the bullies, the best thing to do was to hide in class, because they don't go into class, and actually the teachers think you're working. And actually classrooms are quite boring, so pretty much the only thing you can do when you're in a class is work. And so I'm not convinced I'm that bright, but I did an awful lot of work when I was very young, and so that might have set a work ethic which is probably puritanical in its level, so actually, because I'd always thought of myself as a software geeky guy who's going to revolutionise the world and be the next Bill Gates, who just appeared on the scene at this point. And Mark thought he was going to go and work for Rolls-Royce, which is where he did his year in industry designing turbine blades. When I say designing turbine blades, Mark, I think as far as I can figure out, mostly broke them. Sent them flying off into infinity and beyond, and did all sorts of interesting stuff. But we had great fun, and we had to build this mechanical structure here out of these right-angle aluminium joint things, and we were given quite strict design criteria that a load was placed on this end of our bridge, and as the load was pulled down, the bridge had to take a certain load without deflecting, and then it had to fail at exactly twice that load. I think it was 1.75 or 2.15 or something like that. It had to fail at a particular point, so you had to design it to fail at a specific load. It couldn't deflect beyond a certain point, and you're given all sorts of horrible things that you had to do. And we actually got the best result in that particular test, which, because we had the cameras on us, because it was one team from each of the Cambridge colleges, you probably hear, you can just about hear it starting on the video, that the booing is really one of the most encouraging things I've ever heard in my life. I've figured out through most of my life, you don't have to be popular to be good, but actually, if people are really, really booing you, actually that's as much good as applause, because someone's really appreciated the effort you've gone in to make their lives miserable, which I think is, SMPTE is also helping teach me that. But there are a few interesting things I found at university. One was I made some absolutely awesome friends who, to this day, I'm still in really close contact with. I also realised that you don't actually have to pay that much attention, well, if you didn't back then. So one of the guys that worked with Whittle to invent the jet engine, he was my thermodynamics lecturer. And Mark and I were in one particular lecture, and I was thinking, God, my eyes have been closed for a very long time. I'll just open an eye and see what's going on. Oh, well, Mark's asleep. Oh, and he's asleep as well. So if Prentice is asleep and Mark's asleep, I could probably take my stuff and I could nip out and I could go down the pub, and they will tell me later what happened when they both woke up. To this day, I think they're probably still sleeping there. I also figured out that logic is a thing that's been taught in different verticals in the education industry in a way that's completely incomprehensible to anybody else. I mean, we're all kind of engineering here, and we've all programmed computers and stuff and done logic. Anybody tried to do a pure mathematician's logic? Rowan, respect. Successfully? Well, there we go, thank you. Pretty incomprehensible. My son's a mathematician, and At one point I was trying to help him with some of his studies when he was in his 3rd year at Cardiff, and he just closed the book and said, "Dad, I think we've reached your limit." Very politely took it away from me. He had the good, well, yes. Well, he had the good grace not to pat me on the head because I still paid for the wine and beer in the house. So he's also got the political nous, bless him. The philosopher's logic was wonderful though, because our concepts, there's fundamental concepts of or and. Forget it. Just go and get a book out of any library of philosopher's logic and start reading it. It's like a comedy book. It's unbelievable. I still don't know how you could ever examine on that stuff. And the physicists and medics, they've got their own brand of logic as well. You think it's the same stuff? It just isn't. Just scares me terribly. The pure computer scientists, they seem to have these sort of weird incantation languages. I never understood those. Actually, at university, for giggles, I learned a thing called BCPL, the Basic Cambridge Programming Language, which was one of the forefathers of C. C actually grew out of one of those, but D apparently was a dodo. What can I say? The signal processing, I was quite lucky that despite the fact, I think our signal processing lecturer was Greek. Well, he was definitely not English. You couldn't understand a word he said. And I think we had the thing for, well, this was 1985 at this point. So the pens that he was writing on the brand new fangled invention called the whiteboard were probably had some carcinogenic sort of LSD intoxicant in them, because he used to write his lectures with his nose right close to the pen there, and you could see his little head going up and down. And I'm sure by the end of the lecture he understood what he was writing just as little as we did. And there was this other guy, had this crazy idea that there was this organic LED that if only he could just find a backer for it, someday it'd be huge. I wonder what happened to him. And also Mr. Cumberbatch. Mr. Cumberbatch was lovely. He had a big bushy beard and he looked like a farmer, and he was head of the carbon dioxide lasers that would actually cut through you as soon as look at you. And I still remember going in there with a young lady which he particularly fancied, and he was going to show off the girth of his laser to her. And at some point we all just stopped. I said, "What?" He said, "The safety shield's not on." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "The laser is loose in this room somewhere." I said, "Where?" He said, "I don't know." And it was actually quite serious, so he was quite diminutive. So my best memory, and Rush probably remembers better than I do, he kind of dropped to the floor and scrabbled to where the power breaker was to turn it off before one of us lost a limb or had a tattoo that would never ever go. But one of the most fun things that we did at university, apart from drinking a lot, was we learnt to unicycle and juggle and do all of these crazy things, because back in the day there was actually a fund available to form your own club. So I was actually the secretary and the treasurer of the Cambridge University Tiddlywinks Club. You may laugh, but each Freshers Week we would be in the Freshers Hall with everybody else, and we would persuade people how wonderful Tiddlywinks was, and they'd go, "Oh, okay then, I'll join. Here's whatever it was, £3 or something like that." And we had something like 1,000 people joined, and 20 people who joined up, who actually showed up to any of the events. Yeah. Do the math. So again, entrepreneurial Devlin was actually doing quite well out of this, and if we'd only found something to end it on than Metaxa Greek brandy, I'd probably have more brain cells than I have today. But this was another one of the things that we did, and it was just absolutely great fun. That's Ruth, and that's her sister Heather, and about a year ago, her and her husband had her new pergola built in her garden from wood from the forest that I bought for my wife. So actually, still good friends, and assuming the pergola didn't fall over in the winds a couple of weeks ago, she's probably still alive. I was also a bit of a diver back in the day. There was this young lady that I kind of fancied, and I saw her at the top of this 5-meter board, and I thought, I'll go and talk to her. So I went to the top of the 5-meter board, and she dived off. Now, if you quite kind of fancy a young lady and you're standing there in your Speedos, and remember, this was 1985 probably, so Tom Daly's trunks by today's standards are really quite generous compared to the tighty whities you had back in the... So you're standing there, 5 meters in the air, a queue behind you, and the future love of your life in the water, and you're scared of heights. What do? Well, It was ungraceful, but I hit the ground. Anyway, long story short, I decided I was going to get enamored with this young lady. She wasn't at all enamored with me, and actually I kind of enjoyed diving. I figured out that after a while, if you can control your fall and not, die on impact, it's kind of fun launching yourself off things. So to this day, I am still terrified of heights. I get that I'm smarter than this. I should be able to think about why this is a crazy, crazy phobia to have. But I still can't. It still terrifies me, unless there's water below, in which case I know, hey, I could probably get 3 somersaults in here before I do something really bad, which I did during the Midland and District Championships of 1985 when I snapped one of my vertebrae, which was a really, really stupid thing to do. So I did most of my 3rd year at university lying on the benches to the lecturer because I couldn't really sit or do very much at that stage. But I throw that slide in there, A, because anybody who's seen me without my shirt off goes, holy moly, did you shave? And I still can't believe that there's no hairs on those chests. I'm more like the silverback gorilla nowadays. But after I broke my back, I became a coach and I started coaching people because you know what? It hurts a lot less when somebody else hits the ground flat than if you do it yourself. And so I'd just come back from a coaching session and I'd got this interview with this weird company. Because pretty much in those days, if you're going to do electronics, because there was no money in computing, there wasn't really a computing industry per se, it was all electronics, you designed weapons. That was really where the money was. Apart from these weird people who persuaded me, for some reason that I couldn't figure out, that actually there was something to be gained from television. We didn't really have television. I mean, when I left Australia, it was still black and white. And we couldn't afford a colour telly until, well, pretty much when I was in 6th form. So I didn't really know what telly was. I didn't really understand the thing. But it's not designing weapons, so that's going to be good, because I didn't really like the weapony thing. So I went around some of the things you did as a graduate and ended up in the radio frequency department. That's Peter Shelswell there, for those who trying to figure out what that hairy pom-pom actually is. And I was working for Chris Gandy, and we were doing things like the first flyaway Earth station, so that you could actually drive your satellite dish somewhere, and you could actually uplink while on the road. Heaven to Betsy, that was a novel thing to be able to do back in '88, I think it was. Oh, I forgot the look, a unicycle. I was mostly based either in that shed there or there's another shed off to the right doing my antenna measurements. And because I had a unicycle, I used to unicycle all the way around the grounds just to get from A to B. And I tried so hard to get this clip. Back in the days of analog HD, anybody remember that? HD Mac and extended PAL? There was a test clip shot, which is one of the standard test clips, which was of this beautiful Kingswood country mansion with these beautiful grounds. And if you looked carefully enough, you couldn't see it in SD. The down converter didn't have it. There was this little figure going, a little clown on a unicycle going from the antenna hut off to lunch. You could tell I was going to lunch because I was going quickly. But my first real major thing that I did was radio cameras. So when I joined the BBC, the main way to do radio cameras was a 2-man operation on the ground. We had a person with a camera and a person whose job was to walk backwards and sort of, try not to jump when the tension in the cable got too much, and point that sendy antenna to that receivey antenna somewhere at the top of the thing. And we'd seen, I say we, Chris Gandy at the BBC had seen that the guys at Rye had bought mail order from Andrews Antennas a small RF transmitter, duct taped it to the back of a camera and stuck an antenna in a yogurt pot and a stick and received it with basically 4 juggling sticks on an antenna. And we thought they were crazy doing that until, well, the Royal Albert Hall event about 3 years after that, when the BBC had a system where we'd built essentially the same thing, and I'll show it to you in a second, where it was a Stevie Wonder concert, rotating stage, wonderful, wonderful stage. You couldn't have a cabled camera because you couldn't persuade Stevie Wonder to stop in the middle of the set, turn the lights on, and just unwind the cable around the rotating stage. Apparently that was not a good user experience. So we had to have a radio camera. So we had a radio camera on stage crawling around the Stevie Wonder concert, and we were smart. We got better signal to noise if we used a dish because we were the BBC. we can outthink those Italians. And so we got the guy with his, pointing his dish at the tests, absolutely wonderful, everything worked great. And then on the day of the concert, they turned the lights out. Where is he? Can't see him. Because you can't see through a dish, can you? You can see through that thing. It's almost like the Italians had outsmarted us. I couldn't possibly believe it. Anyway, long story short, this was the thing that Chris Gandy got me to build. It's a thing called the cross dipoles. Basically, the signal comes up through the middle, comes out this way, and those things are half a wavelength apart, so that's a quarter of a wavelength, that's a quarter of, everything's about a quarter of a wavelength, and you sort of saw bits off the end until the signal actually comes out through the antenna rather than just bouncing off the metal and going back down the stick again. And then you adjust the angles and everything so that it's radiating almost an omnidirectional circularly polarized 2.5 gigahertz field. 2.54 was our main frequency, not 2.45, and you shouldn't get that wrong because 2.45 is the resonant frequency of water, and the cameraman's head is mostly... Yeah, don't get that wrong, that's really bad. That's what your microwave oven works at. And if the things are that way round, it's left-hand polarized, and if it's that way round, they're right-hand polarized. So only an idiot would ever get it wrong. And so some of the wonderful highlights of my life were in getting this guy set up. I then had to stop to let all the tennis players run past, and Steffi Graf literally brushed against me in her tennis kit as she went away, and I haven't washed since, because that was just one of those lovely moments to meet a proper athlete, because you remember the elite athlete in that first he still hadn't quite made it by then, but I always wanted to be an elite athlete. So what was interesting was, what was that? That looked like a racing car going past, which reminds me of a story where we took this antenna and we stuck it on the back of a Formula Ford car. And we had 2 days of practice just before the big race. And so the first day of practice, we'd got a brand new version of this antenna because we'd had to go out and get some special solder because we didn't want the thing shaking to bits because this car didn't have much of a suspension. We'd also got a very, 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 very technical builder's foam to hold your soffits on, to fill the radome full of something just to hold the bits in place, again to try and reduce the vibration. And we couldn't get it to work. It was absolutely nothing was being picked up by the receiver. So, because it's my project, I sort of cut the radome off and pulled the thing out, and I looked at my photograph of what it should look like, and I looked at the antenna in the car, and never been particularly good at left and right. So the left-hand circularly polarized sender and the right-hand circularly polarized receiver were designed so that the only thing the receiver was picking up was the reflections of all the metal bits of the inside of the stadium. Except this was Silverstone. So there weren't even any reflections for it to pick up, so we were basically doomed. So like a naughty boy, I was sent back to Kingswood to go and make a new antenna for the morning and fix this thing up and put it on the network analyzer and get it all sorted. So we turned up at Silverstone the following day, and this time there's all sorts of lines going up and down the picture, because this was analog. Anybody here remember analog? Don't put your hand up, Karis, you're too young. This analog stuff. And we figured it must be microphony. It must be that the vibration of the engine is either shaking the antenna or shaking the cables, and the middle of the coax is going backwards and forwards relative to the edges of the coax, and that's what you're seeing, because it's changing the capacitance and therefore the group delay of the signal, because not only was the lines going up and down, but the lines were changing in color with frequency. So it was probably something to do with the subcarrier, so it was probably something to do with modulation. And then we discovered that actually we got the most expensive cables that we could out of the lab, which were the ones for the HP vector analyzer. And these cables were like, that long was about 100 quid back in the 80s, and this was a ridiculous amount of money. And we realized actually, maybe we just try the cheap ones. Put the cheap ones in, and they were just fine. So we very carefully put all but one of the cables back in the box, and then Chris Gandy, I think, whipped me with the last one for being an idiot, which is fair enough. And so, this was end of day 2. So the very last test run on day 2, it seemed to all work. So there we were, Saturday morning, all waiting. This is the first race. They were doing this in Formula 1 already, but to do it in Formula 1, you had to have a helicopter and you had to have sort of two redundancy things, and it was costing a fortune. This was done for about 11.5p, proper BBC tradition. So we got there, everything started, we saw this car go down the straight, and crashed on the first corner. Because, after all, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what television's all about. Dramatic failures that you remember for the rest of your life. So the next big event was the Seoul Olympics. And we'd had early sight of what the Americans were doing. The Americans had stolen the 2.5 gigahertz band, and they'd got this natty sort of tracking system based on an original from Ikigami. You had to be that big to carry the thing around, because you reckon the total weight of the thing was about 17 kilos. So it was a big backpack that went with it, which isn't actually in that shot, and it was just this massive thing. And we were only given the 12 gigahertz frequency, so we thought, well, we've got to do something. So Chris Gandy knew a guy at British Aerospace who had designed a telemetry antenna for getting satellites into their initial orbit. So when a satellite's spat out of its launch vehicle, it's tumbling. You don't know which direction it's going. So you can't use vertical or horizontal polarization. You've got to use a circularly polarized thing, because then you've got some chance of picking it up. So, like all good people, we plagiarized. So we respected the design and did our best to give it full respect by transferring it to the TV domain. There we go. And so this was the design. So there's one picture of it. It was Seoul 1988. There's Sally Gunnell being interviewed with it. For some reason, a 12-inch long, 1-inch diameter flesh-coloured stick designed by a guy whose nickname was Dingo got a nickname in the BBC. I can't quite remember what the nickname is, but if anybody here remembers it, send it on a postcard, not an email, because it'll get filtered. But it was really successful. It was tiny. That whole thing there, that's the batteries, the transmitter, and everything. It weighed about 2 kilos, so it weighed next to nothing, and it could actually cope with whip pans, because it didn't have sort of motors and things that if you panned too fast the motors couldn't. It was the most successful thing at the Seoul Olympics that year, and it was wonderful. Really, really, really good. And I think BBC got an RTS award for that. Thank you, whoever's in the RTS. That was just a lovely, lovely thing. And it was very, very simple and fairly robust. It had a little launcher here, basically a set of cross dipoles like the previous design inside there, and it launched a circularly polarized wave up the tube, and basically a couple of slots, which this was an early prototype. We actually had a slightly bigger holes at the end to reduce the purity of the circular polarization, but actually increase the amount of signal. And these two things could move up and down just to tune it, so that you could control the angle coming out. And there was basically a penny whistle type arrangement at the end to tune the return loss, so that you could get it, because it had to be, I mean, 12.5 gigahertz is like, you know, the wavelength's about 5 mil. So this thing had to be accurate to within 1/5 of a millimeter to get it just right, and we couldn't machine stuff that accurately. So basically, you're watching it on the analyzer and it's like, yep, that's good. Each one hand adjusted by me. And beyond that, the BBC went on to do all sorts of other interesting radio cameras. So the one at the top left was basically a thing called the switched horn, where in vertical blanking we trial the horns and then choose the next one for the next field, not frame. And that was all done by Richard Evans, who was working for me at the time, and I left, which I'll explain in a bit, and John Boyer, who was doing that as well. And that was the next big thing, and then there's been dozens and dozens and dozens ever since. But it was really, really good fun, and I got started in OBs, and as I was saying earlier to wherever you are, saying I'd love to sort of finish my career doing something in OBs, something really kind of funky and novel and interesting. But just like most of my life, I remember the leisure as much as I remember the actual work. And are you in this one, Simon? I've got one of these with Simon Gauntlet in, looking very youthful and fresh-faced. Not fresh-faced now, but you were even more fresh-faced back then, Simon. So we played a lot of croquet, and I thought John Emmett was in one of these. John, I've edited you out. I'm so sorry. Maybe you're under there. No, I'll go and find that one for you later. I thought I'd kept that one in.
We lost anyway.
I think thumped is the word you were looking for, John. But that was absolutely awesome fun. And so this was taking place just at the point when I'd met this young lady, who at the time, this was many years later, I didn't actually have a child with her at that time. That's my son Toby when he was interesting. So I met Jane. She was the accountant at the BBC, selling all sorts of interesting things on behalf of the BBC at the time. But we had this thing at the BBC, which wasn't the official title, but basically it was called Black Spot. Black Spot meant that you got phoned up and said, "Now, Mr Devlin, could you just go away, please? We'll give you money, it'll be fine." And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Well, I wonder if anybody's doing anything interesting out there that might be fun. I've always fancied speaking a foreign language, and I sort of did a little bit of research, and I thought, where would I like to live? It's got to have beaches, it's got to have mountains, it's got to be interesting, and it's got to be foreign. It can't be Australia, because going back to Australia would just be sort of the cheat's way out. Turns out that the Laboratoire Électronique de Rennes was hiring at the time. One of my friends, Ken Boak, had just been refused a job, so I thought, maybe they'll take me. So I phoned them up, and I got a job. So I went to Rennes, and I took up diving again. I really did, and it was a really bad thing to do. And what's really scary is that Jean-Louis Diascorn, one of my good friends there, that's him back in, it's probably about 91, that photograph, last Wednesday was giving his first paper at the SMPTE Annual Technical Conference, and that's what he looks like now. that was him last Wednesday, looking distinctly less hairy than he was back in the day, but he's still a good fun guy, love him to bits. That's what the laboratoire looked like, and like most things in my life, they're all boomerangs. And it's kind of a truism in the media industry: be careful what you do and who you do it to, because it will come back at you eventually. So remember the guy that got kicked out of Cambridge for basically not doing his exams? Well, that's Mark, still a good friend. That's him in his car as I was going to France. So he decided to turn up in his very practical car and wish me good luck in my new opportunities. So some interesting things we did in Rennes. Rennes was basically a half military, half broadcast research arm. And one of the things we got was a thing called the MASPAR, the Massively Parallel Machine. It had, on these 1 meter by 1 meter circuit boards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, there we go, 16 squared chips. Each chip had 64 processing elements. Each element was a 1-bit, single instruction, multiple data chip, which could communicate horizontally and diagonally. So you could effectively communicate from the top right-hand corner of that one to the top bottom left-hand corner of that one in something like 64 cycles. It was all quite deterministic the way it worked. And with this beautifully hand-drawn diagram over here, you can see there's other sort of shortcuts to route stuff around the outside if the linear route was too far. Then there was I/O, and then because RAM was expensive, it's not like it is today. So if you wanted a massive amount of RAM, like 6 or 7 megabytes, you'd have to have a separate RAM card for those kinds of things. And then user-defined I/O, which was often switches or military things going bang. And then parallel disk arrays of the relatively recent RKO 7s, which I think was 70 kilobytes or something like that. So these hard disks you could put on the outside, and there were display devices, and it was just a horrible, monstrous nightmare that generated a lot of heat. But it was fun, because I wasn't directly in that department. They'd hired me, for reasons I still can't understand, to start a new project called Subband coding, because their big brains in the coding department had figured out that Subband was going to be better than the DCT-based MPEG, which was just looking as though it was going to get interesting. And a couple of guys, Jean-Louis Diascorn and Jean-François Vial, were looking at how they would build something like that. And there was a whole team working on this. Anybody remember the ETSI 34 megabit per second codec? Excellent, yeah, so this was the same team doing this. This is like the Skunx team down at the corner of the lab working for that weird English guy they just hired. I'm not going to translate or read that, but the whole idea of subband coding is basically that instead of doing this MPEG thing of these nasty DCTs, which is like half a Fourier transform where you throw the even coefficients away and you generate all of these nasty ringing artifacts, why don't we filter the image properly and take the real image, and then we filter it vertically and horizontally to get the blurry image, and then you filter it again to get the second differential and then the third differential, and because you've filtered it nicely and cleanly, obviously you'll get better compression. And yes, you did get better compression for progressive images. Now, what was the major transmission format of all imagery on the planet at the time? I think it was interlaced. So apart from the little problem that all the images available compressed badly, and all the images that you could compress well were only available on physical film, because by this stage computers hadn't made it into the cinema industry apart from Tron 1, it was a great idea, a really high quality piece of television. One of the things about DCT is it was self-contained within its block. There was no overlap between blocks. But the thing about subband coding was that you were actually doing proper sort of Fourier transforms and proper filtering. In fact, you could decide whatever filtering it was. And you had very interesting problems when you got to the edge of picture, because if you wanted to get full resolution at the edge of the picture and not have the thing go all blurry, you actually had to filter beyond the edge of the picture. And that became really, really interesting. And I'm not going to go into detail there unless anybody wants to go into detail, because it will come back again a little bit later. But I decided that despite the fact that budgie smugglers were twice as big now as they were when I was a diver, everyone knows what a budgie smuggler is? Good. So I became a triathlete, and that helmet is actually on my little pink Brompton outside. And this was good because that guy at the top left-hand corner, his name's Simon Lessing. There was briefly a club ride on a Sunday. He was the world champion at the time. He was just in front of Ivan Kokar, who was the European champion. And he was just in front of Benjamin Bright, who was a 17-year-old guy who actually replaced Simon Lessing as the world champion. And I was fourth on the wheel on that particular club ride. And then Simon pulled off and he went to the back, and then Ivan pulled off and went to the back, and then Ben pulled off and went to the back, and I pulled off and never saw them again for the rest of the day. But for a very brief amount of time, I was at the front of the pack and they were behind me, and that's all that matters. And in fact, that photo was taken probably on the first lap of 2 laps of the Rennes International Triathlon, won by Simon Lessing, and I had the privilege of seeing him win as I was racking my bike and changing my shoes to start my run. Bless him. And so the future Mrs. Devlin at this point was not Mrs. Devlin, and she phoned me up one evening and basically told me, in a way that only she can, that basically my time in France was done and I had to make a life choice pretty quickly. So I did what all good husbands do, and I came back. However, I had no job. And after about 3 months, I figured out, of the 2 job offers I had either all my compression experience going into laser discs, or I had Alchemist. And this chap, Mr. Yulton, basically explained to me that if I took the job with Pioneer, despite the fact that they were going to pay me twice as much as Snell and Wilcox did, that I would burn in hell, and before that he would burn me, and before he did that he'd do other things to me that made me think that burning would probably be a good way out. So I joined Snell and Wilcox, and as usual, all things that go around come around. This was about 1993. That was probably a couple of years later. There's Roderick giving a talk, and this was Roderick on Thursday. Roderick got his Lifetime Achievement Award from SMPTE, and I had the privilege of not only being there, but being on the committee and helping with the photographs and all that sort of thing. And it was wonderful, actually, because he's aged about a year, as far as I can figure out since that. He's stopped dyeing his hair now, of course. But he's such a lovely man. We sat him down in a chair in the corridor of the conference, and it was like being in the presence of royalty. People just do a double take and go, "Roderick?" And then suddenly there's like 50 people there, and as he's minder, I'm sort of third deep in this crowd trying to figure out whether I should give him pills or not to keep him going. It was just one of those lovely, lovely, lovely moments where a person who's done so much for the industry was actually properly honoured by all the people that were there. It was quite emotional, I can tell you. And in fact, many of the moments in Snell were also quite emotional, but often for different reasons. When I joined, we were working on this puppy here, the Alchemist Phase Correlated Standards Converter, 12 view of standard definition loveliness. standard definition lovelies. I mean, we can do pretty much HD on a phone nowadays, but in those days, you had to custom build all of these boards, and how are we doing for time? Not particularly well. We had to go and get chips made. So basically, the history of Alchemist is 12U to 3U to software. However, I was there to do MPEG. So I started off building these MPEG test and measurement things, and I ended up commuting to Geneva to go and write a thing called ETSI TR291, which was the MPEG test and measurement guidelines. And that's basically what we used to launch digital terrestrial television in the UK. And one of the things we did to do that was we got permission from the BBC to build a thing called Test Card M, which was the MPEG version of Test Card F. And these were basically very special bit streams that were used to poke into a zoo of decoders to figure out whether or not the decoders were going to correctly decode the pictures okay, which most of them didn't for about 2 years. And those were the successful ones at the end. And actually, a version of this one was the first ever transport stream broadcast across the continental United States, which I think I still hold the record for. But Roderick told me one lunchtime, he said, we've got this problem that a certain company's having problem moving MPEG from one server to the other. What are you going to do about it? And I went, oh, that's interesting. So it goes across HDSDI, but doesn't go across via MPEG. So maybe, oops, that shouldn't animate. So we ended up creating MXF. We tried with the big British government, but they told us it's already been invented. We went to the Pro-MPEG forum, and they said, oh, well, just make MPEG more interoperable, because it's an MPEG problem, isn't it? Oh, so I've gone too far. Really slow laptop, I'm very sorry. Come on. That one, there we go. The most important thing is this line here, is where I started a project called GeForce. Roderick persuaded me that if I went to the European Commission, that they'd give us millions of euros for running European projects. So I did that, and we ended up running a project called GeForce, which contributed all of its technology into this Pro-MPEG forum, and that's the thing that became MXF. And the BBC contributed some open source code called freemxf.org. The university, or a Portuguese university called INESC, turned their research division into MOG Solutions, and a university from Toulouse spun out a company called OpenCube. And for about the first 10 or 11 years of MXF's existence, pretty much every product used one of those bits of code, and they all came from that one project. So when I introduced myself as Mr MXF, it's my fault, I'm sorry. There's a certain element of truth there, I'm afraid. So MXF was terrible when it was first launched because it was uninteroperable, because all the vendors used it to differentiate themselves, not to create a common standard. But in the 2000s, because CPUs became fast and disks became big and memory became big, we started to try and figure out how we could actually do things not in that old hardware way where everything's streaming, but hold some stuff in memory and do something a little bit more clever so that you could process files on the fly in software as they went through. And that's one of the things that we tried to do in MXF right from the word go, and it's probably the reason why it's stuck around, is because we tried to solve 2010 problems in the architecture so that when the problem was ready, we could solve it then. But you'll note that even though this slide is about 5 years old, all those file formats on the left that we tried to kill off, they're still out there somewhere. No format truly kills off the formats of the past. They still live on in the Library of Congress in James Schneider's collection, unfortunately. But there's also another horror, and this is true particularly of modern standards like SMPTE 2110. If you look, for example, at the dependencies of all the file formats and take all the sum of all the formats of all the pages, you've got about 50,000 pages to implement an MPEG-4 MXF file. And manufacturers think it's easier to do something of their own rather than take the standard. And I still don't quite know how to solve this problem other to improve education. But everybody who tried to introduce a new format couldn't fight against the momentum that MXF had created. We decided that the format must be simple, and we must meet all of those requirements that you see up on the screen there. But one of the problems is the cost of allowing people to be flexible. So for example, oops, is it going to animate? There we go. If you take all the commonly used video file formats that are in use today, and all the audio file formats that are commonly in use today, and all the wrappers that are commonly in use today, and then you say, okay, I'm going to build a transcoder, I'm going to build a product which does all of those, and I'm going to test them all with a 90-second test clip. How long do you think it will take to run your test on a machine running it 10 times faster than real time? So I can guarantee that every transcoder you have ever used is broken, because nobody can do the exhaustive test. And actually, nowadays, because of the disks and memory is so much bigger, you actually have to use a 1-hour test clip, because otherwise you're not exercising page changes. But it's worse than that, because if you then multiply by the fact that there's multiple SDs and HDs and internets and web audio layouts, it's probably 1,800 years. Oh, and we've got 4 HDR formats to layer on top of that. Oh, and immersive audio. And so we've, you know, it's completely untestable the old-fashioned way nowadays. So we have to fundamentally change the way that we're thinking about doing a lot of this testing. And again, if we just look at something like this, this is a diagram from Turner about the source that comes into Atlanta and then goes to the distribution to the main 5 international hubs and then actually ends up on air. So you've got about 200 editorial variants being delivered in those sort of 1,800 different technical formats as well. And MXF has helped a bit there because some of the non-profitable formats are disappearing, but the way in which this industry doesn't throw away old kit until it literally doesn't turn on anymore, we're not killing off those old formats as fast as I would personally like. So one of the bits of work that the DPP did, go DPP, was to think about application specifications. You know, what business problem are we trying to solve? Can we actually, by consent, get rid of a lot of these horrible formats that we don't need to have? And actually, if you read this wonderful book, still available on Amazon, for which I haven't had a royalty check for about 5 years, we actually hint at some of that in the back of this book, that actually this idea of application specifications is really where the world is going. So I became famous mostly as a result of MXF and not my stand-up comedy, nor my timekeeping. This is a little out of date. We're over 2,500 pages now, and there's 6 pages of shopping there, and we've got lots of standards groups. We've got all of those documents which just tell you how the operational patterns work. We've got probably an extra column on that which tells you how to map different essence types into MXF. We've got weird containers that tell you how to put random metadata and captions into MXF. We've got different metadata types that can be put into those different mappings, but it's a toolbox. And without application constraints, we're never going to get into a better place in the world. So I'm going to do a really quick crash course. This was going to take, hopefully if I get this right, under a minute. And it's going to be a bit like an animation. So MXF is split into 2 halves. It's got the metadata view and the physical view. The metadata view looks a little bit like an Avid. It's got different timelines. Each of the timelines represents things. You've got what you play, the material package, and you've got what you store, which is the file package. So we've got descriptors, which are bits of metadata to tell the decoders how to work. In the physical view, we split it into chunks so that actually you can store it on disk and recover certain bits of it. The header tells you what's in the file. The body partition is what is actually the file. The index positions tell you how to find the stuff in the file that you had that was described in the header. And the footer says, oh, I didn't know how long it was when I started. I better put that down somewhere. I'll put it in the footer. Isn't that nice? Then when you split each thing into bits, you've got the key length value bits. The keys tell you what's in there. The length tells you how long it is. And the value is the value of the thing. For example, here's an identification set which tells you what company built the MXF file that you're looking at. Inside the actual body itself, you can interleave stuff, so we can have picture and sound and data. And we've got a system element that Sony invented that nobody really understands. You've also got some index tables which tells you how to convert it from time to physical byte offsets, because we cope with variable length coding. But there is no time code! I'm still really impressed how Edward Munch predicted that brain's gone dead. Deadpool, that's his name, yeah. Deadpool's going to exist. That joke works much better if I remember his name. So in MXF and IMF and all the modern things, we don't use timecode because we use time. Time is actually measured in edit units. Edit units are related to the fundamental frame rate or atomic unit of the thing that you have inside your MXF. Each track is defined in its own edit units, so they don't have to be integer synchronous. We can call that math because we're good at math. When I'd finally finished doing MXF, a guy called Randolph Munro put this on his webcomic stream. We'll just let that hang there. Over 1,000 people have independently sent me this comic. And fundamentally, why are you writing a standard if people aren't going to use it? And that's the really difficult thing. So I'm going to sort of get to that with just a little bits of history. I actually won an award for some software, which is I'm as proud of that as anything else I've ever won. In 2008, Amberfin was spun out from Snell & Wilcox because I foolishly said to the CEO at the time, fed up doing standards and writing stuff down, I'd like to earn some money, please. And he said, here, have these 54 people and this small drop of money, and we'll give you a CEO in 9 months. Never happened. So that was all very exciting. And we had this idea that we were going to ingest stuff and we're going to store it and we're going to be the one-stop shop for doing everything, except we weren't quite big enough. And the integration was one of the things that we found very, very difficult as a relatively small company, and we didn't really have a marketing department. We did do some market research though. We did some conversions with good up and down conversion and put it on different devices, and actually genuinely of all the products on the market, we were the best pictures when people asked what they liked. However, what we did discover is that if you're over 45 and you've not got your reading glasses on, we could show you anything and you'd like it if we smiled nicely. That's a shame. But it was weird because I'd suddenly become a product manager and I had no idea where I'd been trained to be a decent product manager. And then it sort of came to me that the engineers only really care about other engineers. They really don't care what the top guys at the top do, as long as they're doing something interesting. These people only really care about niceness and money come from people at the top. And I can do whatever I like, providing I can keep all the other groups away from me. I can just get on with doing something interesting and maybe turning the company into something good. So if there is a secret to being a good product manager, it's being a tiny, weedy kid who gets bullied at school, as far as I can figure out. I don't know. This shouldn't animate either. So, we ended up doing lots of things at Amberfin, like doing major projects, one of which was a major studio's archive and trying to turn it into components. And one of the interesting things I discovered, and this is still true today, is that a lot of the archives floating around there have lots of metadata, but that metadata has only ever been put in by people describing what they think's there and has never been used or validated by machine to know what's there, which can be really exciting in automated workflows and can result in phone calls sometimes at 2 o'clock in the morning because the guy in America has no idea what's going on and needs your help. And if you can't get your metadata right, then actually you've got this sort of big black hole and lots of money can sink into it. And well, as a consultant nowadays, what I try and help people understand is that if you don't clean the metadata before you try these migration projects, you're basically sunk. Come on, there we go. We also still have a problem today with specifications versus standards. Even I, as the Standards Vice President of SMPTE, sometimes use the word specification, and you can hear the massed tutting of the Board of Directors of SMPTE every time I get this one wrong. And actually it's a common problem in the industry. Nobody really knows the difference between a specification and a standard. They just know it's been written down by someone they trust. And this is something that we need to sort out, that actually the way that standards are done doesn't really reflect the way that products are built and used nowadays. And I'll come to that in a minute or two. And the AMWA and DPP did a really good exercise to try and fix some of this, that the original DPP specification was written in a beautiful PDF by some really smart guy, good-looking, talented, Whimsit, I think his name was, really wonderful, wonderful guy who might buy me a drink later if I keep blowing smoke. And then the next iteration of this thing was basically done as XML so that machines could read it and figure out what the specification said. Because if machines can read it, and the machine that's going to do the transcode can read it, you stand a much better chance of actually getting the machine to do the right thing. But we've not really cracked this. So this was like the first machine-readable spec, which is good. The IMF group's done the next one. Oh, I say this is the first one. We tried back in 2006, but there were some non-software-y people who managed to throw hand grenades in that particular goldfish bowl of water and never succeeded. But we're getting to a point now where I think machine specifications of media files is actually a reality. And the thing that's just been launched by the IMF Users Group, I think, is actually practical. So at this point, Amberfin had gone from a tiny startup with no revenues to actually being quite a successful, profitable company. I'd love to say it was the skill of the CTO, but it was probably luck, if I'm honest. And at 7:54 AM PST on the 6th of April 2014, a date I hardly remember, Dalit acquired Amberfin. Yay! And Dalit was a much, much bigger company. And one of the things about doing mergers and acquisitions is you've got to get the messaging right, and you've got to get the merger done quickly, and you've got to make everybody feel like one team as fast as you possibly can. And we knew that, and I think we did it pretty well. I think we got to the point where in 3 months we had an aligned product strategy, an aligned finance strategy, and we had the messaging done pretty much from day one. Apart from the fact, because that day was the opening day of NAB, literally the paperwork was signed that day, we couldn't have one booth because we didn't know until we built both booths and manned them and staffed them whether or not it was going to be 1 or 2 booths. So that, apart from that little cock-up, we did quite well. So, but we did have all the messaging prepared, and on each booth we had special pods that were, ta-da! Pull the paper away, and suddenly we had cross-promotion. So we'd prepared all of this stuff, and it went down really well. And my job suddenly became strategy and marketing influence, because people figured out I could stand up and talk. And sometimes it even made sense. So I ended up doing things like promoting service-oriented architectures and trying to explain to non-engineers what the hell that stuff was. I tried to explain what stateful and stateless stuff was by giving possibly interesting examples where throwing in the occasional error and calling someone Susan rather than Mr. John Smith explained to people not only the difference between stateless and stateful, but also that error resilience was a thing. And literally 2 years and 6 hours after that event, I formed Mr. MXF. This is, again, as I said, with sort of tagline, cleaning up the mess I've created over the last 20 years. In beautiful Chiddingfold, and if you're not doing anything on Saturday, please come down to the Chiddingfold bonfire. We'll have 10,000 people on the green. We spend about £10,000 on a 12-minute fireworks show, and it was voted the 6th best in the UK last year, so it really is quite a wonderful thing. The bonfire is about 5 times bigger than the villages, but it's lovely. And so there's a few things that I do which are kind of interesting, because I can now do what I want. Mrs. MXF's happy, the money's coming in. One of the things I've really enjoyed doing is Bruce's Shorts, where basically money I receive for doing my day job, I give to students to try and make these videos for me. I try to make it difficult, so I often wear white shirts against a white background in a small room. I make the audio difficult, and so the quality of the Bruce's Shorts is a little bit variable, but typically these kids are somewhere between 16 and 20. They make the videos for me, and they suddenly learn that there's this technology stuff as well as all the video stuff. They thought they wanted to be a director of photography. They suddenly decide that they're a programmer who wants to do compression, as one of the recent guys is. But I also do projects. So this is a project I did where I pulled together 12 companies, said I want to do an API that joins MAMs to products with IMF in the middle. And it took me 6 months to find the funding, write the code, put it on the website, publish it, and then another 6 months to persuade the DPP, the wonderful DPP, to then pick this thing up and do the first of their hackathons on November the 6th. Go hackathon, November the 6th. If you don't know about that, talk to Rowan afterwards, because it's going to be a wonderful, wonderful event. But this also told me, if I can do that, if I can start from nothing, make an API that's agreed by, well, probably 30% of the world's media, why would I bother to standardize it? One person, 6 months, rule the world. Why don't you just do that? Trouble is, I am also SMPTE Standards Vice President. So I actually have to answer that question. And in the industry, I promise I'll finish soon, we're in an unprecedented area of disruption in the way that we consume content. Everybody's conglomerating. It's really complicated to know who's going to survive. Who would have thought 3 years ago that Disney would buy Fox? That was almost unthinkable. Who would have thought that Comcast would buy NBCU and not the other way around? That doesn't make sense. Who would have thought Mr MXF would buy IBM? Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to talk about that. But it's kind of weird. And as Jeff Rossiker of Avid said, he said, "Continuous disruption is here. There will be no more ruption," which I thought was just a wonderful line. And so I thought I'd do this. It's like, okay, what's the history of professional media? Well, I reckon it starts here with the chief monk who was quite good at art, with his slaves, sub-monks, or whatever they call them, who was the copy monks. About 400 AD, this became a popular art form. And I choose this as the start rather than painting, because pretty much the painters were a one-to-one medium. It was like YouTube cat videos, whereas this is more one-to-many, because there was only one book, and the one book was read out by the priests. So therefore, we've got about 1,000 years of continuity until another German, so we've had Mr. Hollerith, now we've got Mr. Gutenberg, had basically the mechanical monk was invented, where you could actually do what the monks did, but you could do that really, really quickly. And so you had to make standards like spelling, because now you had the ability to send this stuff around. Spellings had to become not just local to a town, they had to be, global to a country, because there wasn't anything outside Germany. And that lasted until some Frenchman discovered that he could see shadows in the goop that he poured on bitumen and thought, oh look, I can see shadows, and the sun's out. No, the shadows are still there and the sun's not there. So he invented photography through lucky accidents. So that was, a shorter time. And then shortly after that, some Italian living in England said, hey, I can speak to people in America by speaking into this thing really loudly. So you had radio next, and then you had TV by the 1930s, although it wasn't TV as we know it. And then 20 short years later, we had colour TV coming on the scene, and then digital TV, and then we could do TV on computers, and then you had to sort the operating systems out. And now if you've got a Docker container and 10 cents and 5 Amazon credits, you could do just about anything you like. So if you're a standards organization, that looks a bit rough actually, because if your first standard on human constraints lasts for 1,000 years, and now you can build something, deploy it, and get international agreement faster than you can write it down, what are you going to standardize? I don't actually know the answer to that question, but I do know that because we've gone from something where we're fighting mechanics and chemistry and physics and low-level physics, we're now in an era where what we're really trying to fight against is man-made rules, or woman-made rules, or worse, machine-made rules for other machines. So if we're going to be fighting against something like that, we need to find a completely different way to do our standards, a completely different way to get interoperability, a completely different way to get our platform stable before we do our versatile apps on top of that. I don't know the answer, but I've got a lot of people who are helping me try to figure that out at the moment. So I'll just leave you with this little last bit from Nathan W. Pyle. I don't know if you know his series called Strange Planet, but is one of my favourite cartoons. You can lose 2 hours of your life just flicking through his thing. And his book comes out in about a month. Buy it for your friends for Christmas because it's wonderful. This basically sums up my life better than the last hour and 20 minutes. Because that is science. So the only things I've really learned is it's really hard to learn when your lips are moving. Thank you, Einstein, for that quote. It doesn't matter how horrible it is at the time. Actually, you can learn a lot, even from the really bad things. You just have to figure out what it is that you're learning. And sometimes it's not until 35 years and a few months afterwards until you actually learn what it was that you learned. But the thing that drives me nowadays is it's not really about the money, and it's really about the technology. It's nearly always about the people. Now, if you can spot the people who actually are going to make a difference, you might not know where they're going to make a difference, you just know that they're going to make a difference because there's just something about them that's interesting. And if you have 30 minutes to spare and you're into engineering, I thoroughly recommend not only buying Nathan's book, but listening to this podcast by Roman Mars, who does 99% Invisible, who has the sexiest voice on the planet. Doesn't matter whether you're male, female, or a fish. It's a wonderful voice. It's called Invisible Women. Book written by an English lady, and it is my best learning experience of this year. Most of all, I'd like to thank you lot for coming along and listening to me drone on. It's lovely to have a room of people who are trapped and have to listen to me. Thank you, everyone. I'll do that.
So very quickly, Bruce, so any questions first of all? We've got 5 minutes, actually 5 minutes for questions. stunned silence.
You can do them in the pub afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So Bruce, thank you very much for that. We've had some quite interesting times together. And we went
That's an understatement.
through the agony of saying this is not a standard. Rowan here and Andy, is Andy Wilson here now? His name was on the list, I thought. But we went through the agony of the TSP. And I told you today, and I told a couple of people today, that we made a small program. Went out on Sunday. I missed it, unfortunately, but I can get it on iPlayer. It's called 7 Worlds, 1 Planet. I think it's
Very good. Is it in HLG by any chance?
Not only is it in HLG, it was delivered as an AS11X1 file through the normal BBC system from a TSP 2121 IMF.
It looks stunning.
So a few things to sort out, but we have it working. So Ian, thank you for your original, and it's still moving on, and I'm going to drop the one you designed, and we're going to go to X2, because we can do it now. So I think the stuff we're doing is changing the way that we're thinking about standards, and you know, I always say, I think I'm not sure that I have darts thrown at me anymore. I think you've taken most of the darts now in Smpte.
If you get enough, they're quite comfortable actually. It's like a bed of nails.
But I just want to say thank you again, and so let's give Bruce another big round of applause, and hopefully he never comes back. Thank you, Bruce. Now, unfortunately, again, because of the sending of this wonderful template that has a front about Bill Lovell and the back about what Simon's going to talk about, you can just look at Simon, who's going to do the Smpte words.
You did see slide 6 about my disdain for authority, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
It's good.
I'm going to be very, very brief. So thank you again, Bruce, for a fantastic evening. And I think we're ready for the quiz now on MXF after that run through in, I think it was about 1 minute 30 seconds.
In the style of Pierre Lemieux, yes.
It was pretty comprehensive, so thank you for that. And thank you again for Annie Lucas and NBCUniversal for giving us this